So Rashti, I fully endorse, and I'm sure I'm voicing the views of majority, if not all my fellow delegates. Very logical, very convincing. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I'm curious about the fact that when you wrote Satanic Verses, did you envisage the kind of reaction or the overreaction? And if given an opportunity, would you go for Satanic Verses 2, if I may put it that way, given the kind of reaction that you saw? Or would you defend the free artistic expression? And I wish M.F. Hussain was next to you. I would have asked him the same question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it would have been very difficult to forecast what happened, if only because such a thing had never happened to any writer before. You know, if I had told you on the book's publication day that there was going to be a campaign of international terrorism aimed against me, you would probably have thought that I was megalomaniac. You know, how could books be as important as that? It's even stranger because my previous novel, Shame, was given a prize in Iran. First they pirated it, and then they gave it a prize for the best novel published in translation in Iran that year. I never saw the prize, I never saw any money, but I was told that it did win this prize. And so when the Satanic Verses was published, even in Iran, people thought, oh, well, a book by Rushdie must be okay because the mullahs like it because they gave him that prize. And so the English language bookstores in Tehran and elsewhere imported very large numbers of copies of the Satanic Verses and sold them without any trouble for 6 months. From September 1988 to February 1989, the book was on sale in Tehran and elsewhere in Iran without a single objection being raised to it. Then came the fatwa in February 1989, and of course, the book was suddenly no longer on sale. But that's an example of how unexpected what happened was. I don't know, I don't watch the Satanic Verses is a novel. At the end of the novel, the story's over. I mean, I can't imagine what I would do in Satanic Verses 2. I'm afraid I'll just have to write my next book and see who that upsets. But I think, of course, one of the things about the kind of variant telling of the story of the birth of a religion not unlike Islam in that book is that, of course, it was clear that very orthodox, conservative-minded people might not like what I'd done. But, as I said in my speech, it was absolutely not incumbent on them to read it, Of course, as we also heard, they didn't need to read it in order to take their position. That used to upset me a lot, the fact that people would attack the book without reading it. And then I realized that if you look at the history of literature, the attacks on various novels, the people who attack them have never read them. The people who accused James Joyce's Ulysses of being pornographic had obviously never read James Joyce's Ulysses, because great as Joyce's genius is, the arousing of sexual desire is really not one of his gifts. You know what I mean? The people who accused Nabokov's extraordinarily moral Lolita of being a work of immoral pedophilia had clearly never read that. And so it came to me as a consolation to realize that not reading the book that you're going to burn is maybe a precondition for burning it. If you do something as complicated as actually reading it, maybe the match doesn't light so easily. So of course these things must be allowed. It seems to me that even inside the Islamic tradition, there is plenty that says that this is acceptable behavior. The Prophet Muhammad himself always objected to being deified. He always, the reason for calling himself the messenger and for objecting to the Christians' deification of their prophet was precisely because he said he was only a man and not a divine entity. One of the reasons for the Muslim prohibition on representations, visual representations of the Prophet, was that he feared that if there were paintings of him, that people would worship the paintings. There's the famous story after the death of the Prophet when people were mourning, and his friend Abu Bakr came to the crowd and said, if there are those who worship Muhammad, then you must mourn because Muhammad is dead. But if there are those who worship God, then you should rejoice for God is alive. I mean, that these are very old traditions in Islam, that the Prophet of Islam is not to be deified. He is to be treated as a man who brought a message. And the novel does no more than that. Does no more than that. It does no more than what the Prophet himself would have approved of, in my view. It is other people subsequently who tried to elevate the Prophet of Islam into some kind of divine, semi-divine figure. And it seems to me that, if you like, is the offense against Islam.
So Salman, I'd just like you to reflect a little bit more on the relationship between political freedom and artistic freedom. After all, the Bombay that you've celebrated was a post-imperial Bombay.
Yeah.
There was a great efflorescence of writing under the Tsar in Russia in the 19th century. You'd mentioned China, but in fact, my sense is that artistic achievement in China at the moment is much, much more committed than artistic achievement in India. So how do you see the relationship between the two?
I certainly don't believe that persecution is good for art. You know, there has been remarkable art produced in repressive societies. Or that's to say, if we only think about the famous samizdat literature of the Soviet Union, that was clearly an extraordinary joint effort by many writers and intellectuals to overcome the restraints of that society. Today, we can see that one of the most celebrated cinemas in the world is the cinema of Iran. And clearly, the filmmakers there have found ways to create great art even inside the very restricted confines of the Iran of the Ayatollahs. On the whole, it can also be the case that freedom is bad for art sometimes because, just to contradict myself, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems as if Russian literature has gone into terminal decline. And not just Russian literature, but the literature of Eastern Europe has been much damaged by no longer having an enemy. And now everybody wants to read John Grisham novels, you know, and, you know, God help us, Dan Brown novels. I think Dan Brown is the single most depressing fact about modern literature. Really. I mean, the idea that that book can sell 100 million copies makes one wonder why one bothers. You know? But I think on the whole, you know, I don't want to over-idealize artists because artists can be an unpleasant and selfish lot as well. And competitive and envious and backstabbing and in all sorts of ways human. So I don't want to put them up on some kind of pedestal with a halo on, you know. But the truth is that the production of art is something which requires the confidence that you can express the vision that is in you to express without suffering reprisals. And if you do not have that confidence, then what often follows is a kind of self-censorship which enormously diminishes the culture. And you're right, in China today there is a flowering of art which is greatly encouraged by the kind of regime that is there, or at least enabled. But that's again within very strict limits. I mean, if you tried to write a critical political novel in China today, it would not be published. If you tried to create visual artistic statements which were hostile to the regime, they would not be displayed. So yes, there are brilliant artists in China doing very well, but it's within limits set by the state, and that, in my view, damages the culture in ways that are very difficult to quantify or express. So, I mean, you know, I don't think this is really rocket science. If you want to be able to do good work, you have to feel that there isn't going to be a knock on the door in the middle of the night, you know? It's too often the case in too many countries in the last century that has been the case. I mean, it's true that there was great literature in Tsarist Russia, but as I said, there was also great literature in communist Russia, in spite of communism. Artists, I discovered, are have discovered are very, very stubborn people. And one of the characteristics of art when it is under attack is to try its very best to survive in spite of that attack. Dostoevsky faced a firing squad and went on to write some of the greatest novels ever written in Russia. Jean Genet spent much of his life in prison and wrote a number of works which are amongst the great masterpieces of prison literature, as indeed did Václav Havel. Some of Havel's prison writing actually is rather mysterious. I had to review one of his books, The Letters to Olga, and there were passages in that book that I simply didn't understand. And many years later, I had the opportunity to meet, by then President Havel, and I said, that there were these passages that were completely mysterious to me. And he said, yes, he said, the problem is that in order to communicate with each other in those days, we had to write to each other in very complicated codes. And he said, all these years later now, I've forgotten the code. So even he didn't understand what these passages meant. So, I mean, this is the story of literature has always included a kind of battle against intolerance. But clearly, it's a better thing for that intolerance not to exist.
I just wanted to go on from you're saying that self-censorship's not good and, it's better to write without the knock on the door. But how did you handle all the intolerance and how did it affect your work? Was it an impetus or did it hamper your writing? And were there any novels that have been unpublished or unfinished because of it?
Well, no, there aren't any such novels. I don't know, I discovered that I'm a very obstinate person. And my reaction to people trying to shut me up is to talk louder, And I think the best answer you can give to somebody trying to silence your voice is to try and speak with greater firmness, if somebody's trying to suppress your work, try and write a better book. The best answer of the artist is always in the art, And yes, I've been obliged to become this kind of person who stands at places like this and makes speeches like this. But actually, in my view, the best work I've ever done is the work that I do privately in a room by myself, and then every few years offer it to you to see what you think of it. And my view is, and was then, that the best thing I could possibly do was to go on being the artist I had always tried to be. And I thought there were a number of dangers to me as a writer. One was the danger of cowardice, which could lead to the sort of self-censorship that we've been talking about. The other was the danger of excessive anger, which could lead me to write kind of, revenge books. And I thought both of those would be very destructive to me because they would essentially make me a creature of the attack against me. And I thought really that the thing to do was just to continue as if it had not happened. And to go on try to go on going down the road that I was on, And I guess I discovered I was stubborn enough to do it, I truthfully, I would not, if you had asked me beforehand how I would respond to the kind of attack that was leveled against the Satanic Verses, I wouldn't have bet on myself to have come through it as I have. I would have felt that it would have been very destructive to me just as a person. And it's one of these things about hardship. You don't know how you're going to deal with it until the situation arises. You can't answer these kind of great questions in theory. You can't answer them until they're actually asked. And I think many people put in very difficult situations discover that they have resources that they did not suspect that they had. People dealing with illness or with all kinds of deprivations, people discover amazing resources inside themselves and find a way of getting through. And I think I discovered that I was more resilient than I thought I was, and so here I am, not completely crazy, well, depending who you ask.
But do you self-censorship yourself in a way if
No.
you're now writing about Islam in any way? And,
No, I don't. Do I sound like it? I mean, it's no. It's this. Look, this idea of literature as a vocation, as a calling, I believe very passionately, and it seems to me that my respect for it is too great to wish to abuse it in that way. I mean, if I felt unable to write freely and fully, I would prefer to be silent. It seems to me there are enough books in the world, you know. If all of us who are professional writers were to stop writing today, there would still be too many books in the world. And none of us would be able in our lifetimes to read all the great books that there are to read. So if we are going to have the nerve to add to that mountain, then it has to be a truthful work. It has to be something that comes from your deepest vision of the world, and it has to try and express that. And if it doesn't try and do that, you know, it would be save the trees. You know?
So Salman, you said that Britain protected you as a citizen of that country. What would you say should be the role of a nation which is called upon to protect somebody, a person who is not a citizen but who's persecuted in her own country, like Taslima Nasreen, against its own citizens who are obviously indulging in absolutely wanton violence against her?
Well, I mean, I think you could probably guess that I would wish that she would be protected. I mean, I think that I've met her very little, but I have met her a few times. And I know that when she was offered safe haven in Europe, in, I think, Sweden for a while, and France for a while, and elsewhere, she found it very difficult because she was outside her language, you know, and she found it very difficult to function as an individual and as a writer in those places. And so for her, I think it was very, very important to be able to live where people speak Bengali and where she can function both as an individual in the society, speaking the same language as the people around her, and as a writer. So it seems to me like a very small thing to offer asylum to somebody who needs it. You know, and the principle of asylum has been much diluted in recent years. People have found all kinds of reasons to not grant asylum. But it seems to me a big and generous country like this one should be able to find room for Taslima Nasreen.
The message you gave me was that we live in a culture of political correctness. And quite honestly, what you're saying to each one of us is stop lying and being hypocrites and be free to express what you wish, even though it might be a sacred cow. Am I right?
Well, yeah, you're right. I think that what I'm saying is that we all need to have slightly thicker skins. You know, that's to say, the ease with which people rise affronted by having been offended by this or that, it's just getting to be a little too easy. You know, it's become almost fashionable to be offended. And we just need to sort of deal with things a little bit better, I think. You know, people are always saying things I don't like and writing books I don't like. But, for example, Dan Brown. But I would defend his right to live. You know, I mean, perhaps not to write, but certainly to live. And I just think we need to realize that this is how the world is. People are always going to say things that somebody doesn't like. And if offendedness becomes the criterion for preventing a certain kind of expression, then there will be no expression. There will be nothing in the bookstores. There will be no newspapers. You know, there are plenty of, if politicians stand up and say something that another interest group is offended by, should that politician shut up? If a newspaper says something that some of its readers don't like, should the newspaper stop saying that thing? You know, if offendedness is the line you draw in the sand, then nothing can cross that line because somebody will always be offended. You know, and therefore, offendedness cannot be the limiting point on thought. You know, we have to accept that strongly expressed, deeply held convictions will offend other people. And that's just tough. It's just tough. Deal with it. And that's what you have to do in any robust, open society. You have to deal with it. You accept that that is the price you pay for your own freedom. You know, because to put it very simply, the defense of freedom of speech begins at the point at which somebody says something that you detest. It doesn't end at that point. It begins at that point. Because it is no trick to defend the right to speak of people that you agree with or to whose opinions you are essentially indifferent. It's only when people say things that you actually can't stand that you discover whether you are in favor of freedom of speech or not. Because if you think that that speech should be prohibited, then you are not in favor of freedom of speech, you are a censor. And so the defense of free speech begins exactly at the point at which people offend you. That is the speech that must be defended, otherwise there is no such thing as free speech.
For someone who likes to dream, for someone who likes to live life through more than just a social process, for someone who likes to feel, how does he or she know, that literature is his calling, and when does he know that it's time to go? Thank you.
Well, very tough question, you know, because in my experience, the people I know who have become professional writers, good writers, have simply had in themselves a very strong motivation to do that kind of work, you know, and those who have not become professional writers have not had such a strong motivation. I mean, it's the kind of work for which you need to be a self-starter. Nobody will give you permission to do it. Nobody particularly wants you to do it. You know, you have to do it because you can't not do it. You know, that's the only reason to be a writer is because you can't avoid being a writer. If there was a way to not write books for me, I would not write books. It's much, much easier to not write books than to write books. And the reason I write books is because I have never in my life been able to avoid writing them. It fulfills a very profound need in me to do that. And I think it's true of most true writers that they would feel like that. And so it is a question, you're right, it is a question of looking inside, you know, and to see whether in you there is that motivation or not. You know, now some writers are lucky in that very early in their lives, they achieve a degree of respect and success. Many of my contemporaries in Britain achieved that success at a much higher speed than I did. You know, well, for example, Martin Amis and Ian McEwan were both very well recognized as writers in their mid-20s, you know, and had this sort of flying start and have continued on from that. This was not what happened to me. I had a very stumbling, awkward start. And to put it simply, I graduated from university in 1968, and Midnight Children was published in 1981. It took me almost 13 years to learn how to write. And during that time, I was watching my contemporaries kind of zoom off in Rolls Royces while I was on the starting line on a bicycle. And I hated them, you know, obviously. But if I look back at that self, I'm kind of proud of that young man's willingness to dedicate 12 years of his life trying to learn how to do something without any guarantee that he would ever be any good at it. You know, and if somebody asked me now, you know, how would you like to spend the next 12 years trying to do something with no guarantee that you'll ever be able to do it, I would look at them as if they were crazy, you know. But that's what I did, and that's what I think many writers do. They have that dedication and devotion to the art, to take whatever length of time it takes in order to learn how to do it, you know. And if you don't have that kind of internal motivation, then, you know, be an accountant. You know, do something else.
When you won the Booker of Booker Awards a few years ago, there was a lot of talk in terms of if you join the list of Rabindranath Tagore, V.S. Naipaul to win the big prize. Curious about your thoughts. Are you ambivalent about the big prize? Would you be pleasantly surprised? And your viewpoints on that.
The prize? No, I'm in favor of prizes.
The
know,
big prize,
I'd-
Nobel
I'd-
Prize.
I'd like lots and lots of them. Thank you very much. If you have any to donate, please send them this way. No, I mean, you can be hypocritical about all this, but the truth is that everybody likes to have a pat on the back, and everybody likes to have their work recognized. It's just human nature, that. But I think you have to also understand that they are kind of unimportant, that in any kind of long scheme. Do you remember who won the Booker Prize last year? Because I don't. Who won the Nobel Prize last year? No, I mean, it's, see, somebody remembers, one person. The point I'm making is that the real prizes of literature are not these. The reason you write books is to write something which you hope will endure, and that people will go on reading it for many years, and, if possible, long after you yourself are alive, and so on. And for me, for example, as was mentioned, Midnight Children is almost 30 years old. It's 30 years old next year. I mean, almost 35 years since I started writing it. And the idea that this book, which I dreamed up when I was still in my 20s, should still be interesting and valuable and enjoyable to readers now that I'm in my 60s, that people who were not born when the book came out, still pick it up and enjoy reading it. To me, that's a bigger prize than any prize given by a jury. Because as I say, if you write this kind of book, you're writing it to try and create something that lasts. You're trying to leave behind you a shelf of books that will last and that people will be able to read with pleasure in the future, and in the present and in the future. And at the other extreme of popular fiction, the desire to write is not for longevity, it's for instant gratification, and that's fine. That there are books that are written in order to please people right now with really no thought to longevity. The most popular American novel of the 1930s was a novel called The Green Hat by Michael Arlen. It sold vast numbers of copies. It has not been in print for 50 years. And that's at the popular end of the spectrum, that's how it goes. At this end of the spectrum, there was a very interesting study that happened in British publishing about 10 years ago, when the Trade magazine asked publishers for the list, not of their top 10 best-selling titles of the year, but of the top 10 best-selling titles in the history of the publishing house. And the moment they asked that question, you saw that the cream rose to the top. At that point, the best-selling titles were Joyce, Proust, Kafka, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Nabokov, the writers who were supposed to be not commercial. But if you look at it in the long view, their work endures for generations and ends up actually outstripping, the Ian Flemings and the Agatha Christie's and so on. So that's, for me, what matters more. But since I won't be around to see my work survive after my death, in the meanwhile, I'm happy to have the prizes.
Where does this freedom to dissent start, and where does a dissent to freedom stop? Or the vice versa?
Could you say a little more about that? What do you mean? You mean about the limits of it?
Limits of, exactly. I mean, both are fine. There's a freedom to dissent, and one can dissent to freedom as well. The question is, where does one start and where does one stop?
Well,
it's a classical question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a question which perhaps we don't have time to answer properly, but let me just say something about it. There is remember I mentioned Saul Bellow in my remarks. In another novel of Saul Bellow's, The Adventures of Augie Marsh, the narrator and title character, Augie Marsh, says at the beginning of the novel, he says, there is no fineness or accuracy in suppression. If you hold down one thing, you hold down the adjoining. And this is a version of the old statement that freedom is indivisible. there's no such thing as being almost free. You are either free or you're not free. And this is an absolute. You know, it's simply, in a society is either free or it's not free. The limitations on freedom that societies decide to place do exist, and different societies place those boundaries in different places. For example, in England, the Race Relations Act makes it a crime to make statements which are racially bigoted, a crime which is punishable by law. In America, the First Amendment of the American Constitution guarantees your right to make any statement, even if it's hate speech. And so America sets the bounds more broadly than England. The American idea is that you can't decide. Who decides what is hateful and what is not? The moment somebody starts making those decisions, you know, who guards the guards? You know, and so there, the view behind the First Amendment is that it's better said than not said. That hateful thought does not cease to exist if you ban its expression. And in some ways, by making it taboo, you can increase its power rather than reduce its power. You can drive it underground and make it seem glamorous and radical, and you know, forbidden fruit tastes sweeter. So that's there is a clear difference between the British position and the American position. So there are always limitations that societies decide that they will place on freedom, and where they place those limitations is a matter for that society to decide, of course. But my general argument would be that the onus of proof, the burden of proof, must always be on the would-be censor. You know, that the principle must be liberty. And if you want to limit that liberty, you'd better have a damn good argument. You know, many countries, for instance, make reporting restrictions in time of war. And journalists always complain about them. You know, the American government during the recent Iraq war, for a long time, made it illegal to print photographs of the bodies of American soldiers returning in coffins to the United States, because they thought that that would reduce support for the war effort. And clearly, journalists disapproved of that limitation very strongly, saying, no, why should they not report that, since it was actually taking place? So this is a very big argument about where you place the limitations. And as I say, I think as far as I can get today is to say that the principle, in my view, should be absolute freedom. That's the principle. And then if there are specific cases where you think that principle should be violated, then you need to prove that. You know, the defenders of freedom should not have to prove the validity of freedom. It's those who would restrict it who need to prove that there is a reason for restricting it. And the standard of proof should be very high. You know, it should be extremely difficult to make that case. And I mean, I think that's as far as I can go right now.
Hi. I was wondering, out of all your novels, which are your favorites? The ones which are banned or the ones which win prizes?
Sometimes it's the same thing. The Satanic Verses won a number of prizes, for example. You know, I don't know what my favorite novels are. I mean, it depends what day of the week you ask me. You know, I mean, truthfully, I do not read the works of Salman Rushdie. I don't read my books. They would be tedious for me to read my books. By the time I've spent all this time writing them, I'm sick of them. So I don't like them much. He lied. You know, I mean, I could say it's obvious that what happened with Midnight Children was really very important for me in my life as a writer. And so, you know, I treasure what happened to that book. It was a wonderful moment for me. You know, I'm extremely fond of Haroun and the Sea of Stories because I wrote it for my son. You know, and it's unusual to write a book to please an audience of one. But after I wrote it, I must say it occurred to me that many of the children's books that I most admired had also been written for very specific children. You know, that Alice in Wonderland was written for Alice Liddell, that Winnie the Pooh was written for Christopher Robin Milne, that Peter Pan was written for the 5 Llewellyn Davis boys. That, you know, if you look over and over again and you see that these artists were writing to please very, very particular individuals. And somehow by doing that, they created something of universal beauty. You know? I mean, and if you look at the character of Alice in Alice, she's not just kind of sort of she's not like a cookie cutter, stereotypical pretty little girl. She's got a very particular personality. For instance, Alice is very, very bossy. She's always telling people off. She scolds people all the way through Wonderland. She tells people off. And this is extraordinary because she's, after all, in Wonderland. She doesn't even know the rules of the universe, you know. And even though she doesn't know what shape the world is or what size people are, she's still prepared to tell them that they're behaving badly and that they should do better, you know. And it's quite clear to me that that's a little girl that the author knew. You know, that that's not some random child. That's a portrait of a child, you know. And that makes the book specific in a way that increases its magic. So I think, you know, Haroun is a book that I'm very, very happy with. The Moor's Last Sigh was a very important novel to me because, well, for 2 reasons. First of all, it was the first adult novel that I wrote after the Satanic Verses, so there was kind of a lot riding on it, you know. And the fact that it did okay was a relief. Also, it was the only novel that I've ever written, which largely takes place in India, that I wrote at a time that I was not able to come to India. And so it's a novel that's, of all my novels, it's the only one that I consider to be a novel written in a condition of exile. You know? And I was very anxious not to get it wrong. You know, I've all my life not wanted to write outsider novels about this country. I wanted to write insider novels about this country. And I thought this was difficult, you know, because there was years and years was not allowed to set foot in here. And the thing that most pleased me when the book came out was that friends of mine in India said to me, "Did you sneak in? Somehow you must have sneaked in." And I said, "No, I didn't." They said, "Well, how do you know all that stuff?" You know? And I thought, good, okay, phew, got away with it. Martin Amis has this term, which I think is very useful. He says, when you publish a book, you either get away with it or you don't get away with it. and I think that I got away with it. So, you know, I don't know. As I say, depending on what day I'm in and what we're talking about, I would talk about a different book, you know. I mean, I'm very fond of The Enchantress of Florence. It was an enormously pleasurable book for me to write. But sometimes I think I'm actually more proud of Shalimar the Clown, which is a much darker book, tougher book to write. You know, maybe less crowd-pleasing, you know, than The Enchantress of Florence, but maybe better. I don't know, you know. But the truth is, I really don't know. I just write them. You know, you have to tell me what's better than what and what you think. I mean, I'm just the poor schmuck who has to sit there doing the work, you know.
Before we close, I'd like you to tell us about Pakistan. What's gone wrong there? I mean, it's part of your ancestry. You've written books about it. You actually lived there for a while.
I don't know. How long have you got? What's gone wrong in Pakistan?
Okay, tell us in short.
Well,
headlines.
Well, I mean, you know, sometimes one of the problems of having written a few books is that sometimes you can't remember which book somebody says something in. But there's one of these books in which one of the characters talks about the kind of failure of Pakistan as being a failure of the dreaming mind. He says it's insufficiently imagined, you know. He says it's described as this curious bird, 2 wings without a body. And then one of the wings falls off, of course. And it seems to me that in that moment, the moment of the secession of Bangladesh, you can see what's wrong with the idea of Pakistan. You know, the idea that religion was a sufficient glue to hold together these very different worlds. And not just Bangladesh, Pakistan, but even Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan. You know, it's a problem, I think, of conception. And Pakistan has suffered from that. And I don't know, what am I to say? I can only say what I think most of you probably know. The problem of Pakistan right now is that you have a 3-part power structure of which the elected government is the least powerful. You know, you have a military, a very powerful military engine, you have an extremely powerful intelligence service, and you have an elected government. And the elected government is completely as nothing compared to the power of the other two. So the question is, what does the army think and what does the ISI think? And how do they relate to the rest of the world? And clearly, many of the problems, including the attacks in Bombay and so on, arise out of that anomaly. It may well be that the Pakistani government didn't even know about the attacks in advance because they were not planned with their consent. So, or maybe they did, but there's nothing they could do about it. So when you've got that kind of a power elite, it creates all kinds of problems. Now, I mean, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen what may or may not be a change of attitude in Pakistan. I mean, the fact that, you know, whatever it is, 8, 9, 10 senior Taliban leaders have been rounded up, you know, in almost as many days, after in the previous 10 years, none of them were arrested, suggests that people knew where they were all along, or had a damn good idea of where they were. So I mean, look, in the end, nations act out of self-interest. They act out of what they believe is where their interest lies. And for a long time, Pakistan believed that to support the so-called Afghan Taliban was in their interests because Pakistan has been worried about the rise of Indian influence in Afghanistan and believed that the Afghan Taliban could act as a Pakistani counterweight to that growing Indian influence in Afghanistan. As usual, you know, the obsession with India cripples Pakistan's foreign policy. If they've now ceased to think that, and are willing to move against the Afghan Taliban as well as the so-called Pakistani Taliban, whether there's any real difference, I'm not sure, then that's a change of mood. You know? And if they are willing to carry that on to attack the other groups, including the ones that have attacked this country, you know, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, then we're talking, you know, but I don't know, my distrust of the Pakistani power elite is almost infinite.
Will they ever get a full-fledged democracy or always be a bonsai democracy?
Well, they would have, you know, the people want it. You know, it's very interesting. Every time the people of Pakistan are allowed to vote, they vote in very large numbers. They're very enthusiastic about the idea of voting, and they never vote for the extremist parties. You know, the religious parties get like 1% of the vote. You know? So when you ask the people of Pakistan, they are not radical or fundamentalist. You know? But nobody asks them. You know, or not very often. So, I mean, I could go on for several hours if you like, because, but let's just stop there. It's a mess, Pakistan, you know, and I think right now it's possible that it is the most important country in the world. I think what happens in Pakistan may well determine all our fates, you know, and if they do indeed move against the extremists, then the world will go in one direction, and if they do not, then the world may very well go in another direction that I don't think any of us want to go in.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last personal question, and then we'll close it.
Okay.
I hope you want to hit me for it.
You're very far away.
Well, it's about, let's take it from, for men like me who are over 60 years old and lots of young-blooded men here. Everybody would like to know the secret of you escorting charming young ladies or being surrounded by them at all times. Want to tell us what it is?
Yeah, drugs.
Beg your pardon?
It's the use of narcotics. I basically drug them and bend them to my will. You know,
you obviously don't want to tell us.
That's it. I'm sorry. No, you think that's not the truth? I don't know. You know, I'm just lucky.
Okay. Well, you won't tell us your mojo. Well, let me thank Sir Salman Rushdie. As you can see that he speaks as well as he writes. Fantastically entertaining, witty, wide-ranging subject, a sharp, analytical mind, does not avoid any question. I think it's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
you.